In the name of God, hello everybody. This is the first session of your syntax lesson. In this lesson, I want to talk about the government and binding theory. The aim of this book is to offer an introduction to the version of generative syntax usually referred to as government and binding theory. Okay. Government and binding theory is a natural development of earlier versions of generative grammar initiated by Noam Chomsky some 30 years ago. Okay, this kind of theory started with Noam Chomsky about 30 years ago. We call it government and binding theory. Okay, we call it government and binding theory. This book is based on this kind of theory, government and binding. Okay, first of all, I want to talk about the linguistics. What is linguistics? The science of language. Okay, we call linguistics the science of language. When asked to indicate one prominent feature that distinguishes human beings from animals, many would probably say that this feature is language. You know, if I ask you about the main difference between human beings and the animal, maybe most of you or all of you say that this feature is language. Okay, this is the main difference. Linguistics, the study of language, gives us an insight into the human mind. By studying the linguistics, we can find the human mind working. Okay, so we can find how the mind of the human beings can work. Leonard Bloomfield, as one of those linguists, defined linguistics as the science of language. Okay, this is the definition of linguistics, the science of language. Like all scientists, linguistics will aim at formulating the general principles to account for the data with which they are faced. Okay, like all sciences which they have a kind of related data, linguistics, again, as a science of language, has a kind of data, okay, in languages which study those data. Linguistics try to formulate generalization about linguistic data. It means language. Okay, when we have a kind of generalization about some data, this is we can produce a kind of language. For example, English language, Persian language, Arabic language, they are consist of some linguistic data. There are various ways of approaching the study of language. We have, various ways to approach the study of language. One is the traditional view, okay, of language study. We have a kind of traditional ways or traditional views to study all languages, where the focus is often on the study of one specific language, say English. So in traditional view of language study, linguistics just focus on just one specific language. For example, they focus on the studying of English, for example, language, or just Persian language, just Arabic language. This is a kind of traditional view. They focus on just one, specific language. A linguist studying English will try to characterize the principle that determine the formation of English sentences. So when they focus on just one, a specific language, so they focus on the data on that language and they started to studying the sentences of that language. The goal will be to provide a systematic description of English sentence formation. They can say how the sentences in English, for example, are formed. Okay, the grammar of English. So when they talk about the systematic description of, for example, English sentence formation, they can write the grammar of that language. Okay, this is, we call it the grammar in traditional view. Well-formed English sentences are constructed according to the grammar of English. They are grammatical, so if each sentence, is according to that rule and to that sentence formation, we call it grammatical sentence. And those sentences which are not formed according to the grammar of English, we call them ungrammatical sentences, which indicated by the asterisk, you see, kind of a star, So this is the, traditional view, which focus just on one specific language and describe the, sentences of that language. If if the sentences of that language is based on the grammar of that language, we call them grammatical, and if they are not, we call them ungrammatical, which indicated by the kind of asterisk beside those sentences. So this is traditional view. When writing the grammar, the linguist will not stop at merely listing examples with the appropriate grammaticality judgment. Okay, we cannot list all the example, all the sentences of one language. Okay, a simple catalog of sentences may be an interesting basis for discussion, but it cannot be the ultimate goal of scientific research. Okay, the ultimate goal of the scientific research in in linguistics is not to just gather all the sentences in one language. Okay, in addition to describing the data, the linguist will formulate general principles which will be applicable to further data. So the goal of the linguist is to formulate the general principle. Okay, the total of all the rules and principles that have been formulated with respect to a language constitute the grammar of that language. So we call those those rules and those principles in each language, we call them grammar of that language. So a grammar of a language is a coherent system of rules and principles that are at the basis of the grammatical sentences of a language. We say that the grammar generates the sentences of a language. So at the other step, after the traditional view, okay, we can talk about the rules, the general rules and principles. We call these general rules and principles in each language, we call them grammar of that language. And you can say that a grammar generates the sentences of a language, for example English language or Persian or Arabic language. A first requirement for any grammar, so we want to talk about the grammar and the characteristics of each grammar in each language. A first requirement for any grammar is that it provides a characterization of the language it describes, which means the grammar must be able to distinguish those strings of words which are sentences of the language from those which are not sentences of a language in question. Such a grammar will be observationally adequate. So the first step in the grammar is the observation, or the first characteristics of each grammar is the feature of observationally adequate. Okay, the grammar so in each language must be able to distinguish those strings of words which are sentences of the language from those which are not sentences of the language. So this is the first step of each grammar, the observationally adequate. Okay, so this is the first step and the first characteristics of each grammar. They have a kind of observationally adequate. So the other features of the grammar. First, the native speaker. Okay, what is the knowledge of the native speaker? Not only linguists have the ability to judge, for example, English sentences, every native speaker of English knows intuitively that which sentences are acceptable and which are not. Okay, I mean the native speaker of each language. For example, if you are native speakers of Arabic language, for example, or Persian language or English language, if I ask you about the grammaticality or ungrammaticality of each sentence, you can judge according to your intuition, okay, because you are the native speaker of that language. Okay, so besides linguistics, speakers of each language has a kind of intuition to judge about the acceptability or grammaticality of each sentence, or ungrammaticality of each sentence. For example, if I ask an English speaker these two sentences, the first one, for example, I don't like detective stories. If I ask about this sentence from the English language speaker, the grammaticality of about the grammaticality or ungrammaticality of this sentence, the native speaker of English, according to his intuition, may say that this is grammatical. But if I say this sentence like this, I detective stories like. So the native speaker says that no, this is ungrammatical sentence. So this judgment is based on his or her intuition. So moreover, every native speaker of English produces a large number of grammatical sentences and understands the English sentences that he comes across. So all of us, as a native speaker of our language, can produce a large number of sentences in our life. Yes, the native speaker may not be able to formulate the general principles that underline the sentences he produces, but he has an unconscious knowledge of such a principle. So if I ask a native speaker to talk about the principles underlying each sentence, maybe he or she cannot explain the principle, but he unconsciously can judge about the ungrammaticality or grammaticality of the sentence. He has a kind of intuition about his or her language. He has internalized a grammar of the language. Okay, so we have a kind of internalized grammar, all of us, about our language. The native speakers, unconscious knowledge of the grammar of his language is the focus of inquiry for linguistic working in Chomskyan tradition. So, Chomskyan, in Chomskyan tradition, the followers of Chomsky and his followers work on that knowledge of the native speaker. Okay, that unconscious knowledge of the native speaker about his or her language. We say that grammar reaches descriptive adequacy if, in addition to describing the data, it provides an account for the native speaker's intuition. So the Chomsky, and his followers focus on the native speaker's intuition, this unconscious knowledge, which help the native speaker to judge his or her specific language. So this is, as I know, this is the first I talk about the observational adequacy, but here I want to talk about another adequacy, descriptive adequacy. In observational adequacy, we just provide a description of the facts, as you know. So we just describe the fact. However, if we stop at this point, we are missing a significant generalization. A descriptively adequate grammar will not simply provide an analysis for sentences, but it will try to capture the relation between sentences and formulate a general principle which sentences are felt to be unacceptable. So the second step after the observational adequacy, we have a kind of descriptive adequacy, which talk about the principles underlying each sentence. each sentence. So a descriptive adequate grammar will not only describe the linguistic data like observational adequacy, but it will contain the general principles and processes that enable the native speaker to produce and interpret sentences in his language and decide on the acceptability of the sentences. So the second step and the other feature of the grammar is descriptive adequacy. Observational adequacy just has a kind of description of the facts, but in descriptive adequacy we can talk about those principles and rules which enable the native speaker to produce and interpret his or her language. Such a grammar is an explicit formulation of the tactic linguistic knowledge of the native speaker, his internal grammar. So we want to talk about the internal grammar of native speaker, that intuition, unconscious knowledge of each native speaker. The shift of focus from language itself to the native speaker's knowledge of language is the major feature of the Chomskyan tradition. So as I told you, Chomsky and his followers focus on the speaker's knowledge of language. In the intuition of each native speaker, on the unconscious knowledge of the each native speaker. Both the generative linguist and the traditional linguist will be constructing grammars, means that general systems that underlie the sentences of a language. This is the definition of grammar. General systems that underlie the sentences of a language. But the generative linguist conceives of his grammar as a reflex of the native speaker competence. The grammar is a representation of the speaker's internal linguistic knowledge. So according to generative linguist view, the grammar is a representation of the speaker's internal linguistic knowledge. Okay, as I told you, all of us as a native speaker have a kind of internal linguistic knowledge, kind of intuition, kind of unconscious knowledge, which enable us to judge our language sentences. So this is the definition of grammar. The last term in which I want to talk about it in this session is the difference between grammaticality and acceptability. Okay, we have a kind of term, we call them grammaticality and acceptability. Grammaticality is a theoretical notion. Okay, a sentence is grammatical. We call, a sentence is grammatical if it is formed according to the grammar of, for example, English, as formulated by the linguist. So we call a sentence grammatical if that sentence is according to our, grammar, our principles. Okay, we call it, grammatical sentence. But acceptability, on the other hand, is the term which characterizes the native speaker's intuitions about the linguistic data. If I ask you about, for example, about a kind of, for example, Arabic sentence, and ask you about the grammaticality or ungrammaticality of that, you can talk about the acceptability of that sentence. So because you as a native speaker of, for example, Arabic language cannot, for example, explain the sentence according to the rules or principles, just you can say that this sentence is okay or not. It's not it's not okay. So you can't just talk about the acceptability of that sentence. So acceptability is a term which characterizes the native speaker's intuitions about the linguistic data. So the native speaker who judges a sentence cannot decide whether it is grammatical. He only has intuitions about acceptability. Okay, it is for the linguist to determine whether the acceptability of a a sentence is due to grammatical principles or whether it may be due to other factors. So the linguistics, I mean, according to the rules and grammars, they can talk about the grammaticality. But we, as a native speaker of each language, we just can't talk about the acceptability of sentences based on our intuitions, okay? This entails that there may be disagreement between linguists as to whether certain unacceptable sentences are grammatical or not. The linguist will have to determine to what degree the unacceptability of a sentence is to be accounted for in terms of the grammar. So there are, I mean, differences between grammaticality and acceptability. As I told you, the grammaticality, judgment about the grammaticality of sentences, I mean, is based on the linguist knowledge, and the judges about the, I mean, acceptability are based on the intuitions of the native speakers, I mean, the native speaker's intuition. So we, as a native speaker, talk about the acceptability of the sentences, and linguists, according to the grammar, talk about the grammaticality of language. So this is the difference between grammaticality and acceptability. So that's enough for today. So in this session, I talk about the, I mean, government and binding theory. First, we talk about the linguistic. What is linguistic? The science of language. Then we talk about, I talked about the native speaker, the knowledge and the intuition, and then I talked about the features of the grammar, for example, observational adequacy and descriptive adequacy. And at last, I talk about the differences between grammaticality and acceptability. Okay, thank you for your attention, and that's enough for today. Goodbye, everybody.